You know, basically, like, the taller the building, the thicker the walls. And there's actually, I don't have a picture of it, but there's a famous building that he did, which is kind of considered this big transitional building, and I thought it was fascinating because it's the tallest building of its type. It was basically still using the same kind of walls and stuff, and like the bottom floor, the walls are 6 feet thick, and the building's still sunk. So they actually had to feedback. They still had to build these special stairs basically because you couldn't get in the front door. So anyone ever heard of Frank Loyd Wright? I figured most people had, right? He was Louis Sullivan's student, and so he kind of had this rebuttal statement, which, okay, great, no one kind of pay attention. It sounds kind of like a poem. It's really so his thing was he kind of saw this. No, it should be a little more like nature, where like you have flowers and stuff like that, and they're beautiful, but they're extremely functional at the same time. So his whole thing is that they show up at the exact same time, and what you kind of notice if you really start to get into kind of the science of how people view products and things like that, you quickly realize that form and function, the whole separation of the two is kind of it's made up. It's when people look at products, they don't necessarily go, all right, what's the function of this thing? Okay, well, now I'm going to look at the point. Now they actually have an emotional response to it right away. They then might think of what it does. I mean, if you look at buildings, for example, you might look at a building, and the first response usually is that a pretty building or not? You don't look at it and go, is that a library? I mean, you might do that with certain ones, don't get me wrong, like churches, the Capitol, certainly you're going to look at that and say, it's got a bunch of columns, it's probably got a bunch of assholes in it or something. Okay, so let's see, moving on. Oh, sorry, this is actually Frank Loyd Wright. I forgot to actually put a video. He apparently has awesome bow ties. And he's kind of like a Jedi master of architecture. So he did some really cool stuff, lots of really cool buildings. Yeah. So, all right. So I don't want to make this sound like I'm like interviewing or anything, but I just a little bit talk about myself, and that's what I do best. So, and what I do. So there's lots of terms for it, but most people kind of know it as usability, but I like the fluffy words experience designer. And so basically there's like a bunch of parts to what I do, right? I kind of think of it in 3 parts. There's the conceptual, which is basically like, okay, what am I going to come up with, kind of a thing. And then it gets into interactive of, okay, well, how is someone going to use this thing? And then the last one there, which is how's this thing going to look? And that's a really basic way of thinking of it. It's a little more complex than that, of course. Conceptual is basically inventing shit, which is tough to do. But interactive design, there's a whole bunch of, you got to serve people, you got to do a whole bunch of stuff with that. And then the aesthetics, a lot of people just kind of think of that as how does it look, is it a green button, a red button, that kind of stuff. But really, aesthetics comes down to everything that you can, it's really all the tangible stuff. How, if it had a smell, hopefully not, but if it had a smell, that would be included in there. All that. What's that? All right. So, so this slide seems kind of out of place, but basically, part of this is to show that, let me go back, to show that these, while they look like they're kind of, within this, and you do this, and you do this, they're really, there's a lot of blur in between all these, there's not necessarily like, and then I do this, and this, and this. Like, certainly you have to have the conceptual part before you can really do anything else. But as far as those last two, they do kind of blur a little bit. This is actually something I often get into a little bit of an argument with my boss about. But basically, you can't just do one and then move on to the other. So, like, for example, here would be kind of your typical wireframe over here on the side. And then this would be more of a sketch, which is not what the product would end up looking like at all, but it's sort of kind of like, okay, well, let's get some ideas of what it could be. So the main reason I'm showing this right here is I kind of wanted to show that, aesthetics can play a role in how a user perceives an individual thing. And I don't want to go off into usability land here, but in the right side you can see that the Frank button is not quite as important as the Tom button. But on the left side, clearly the Frank button is much more important. So it's little things like that that can really affect things. Okay, so last little bit about usability, and then I'm going to move back to form and function. So usability for dummies, this slide will probably load really slowly, so I'm just going to... do that. Okay, this is kind of the usability process, and honestly, most places kind of have their own process. This is kind of a developing field. I mean, it started way back in the day, and I'll just kind of run through why they call it so many different things. So way back in the day, like when they were inventing jets, there was what most people call the human factors person or usability engineer. And when you think about those guys, they were more like the person who came up with special lenses for goggles and stuff for pilots. Like, it was much more scientific. They usually had an engineering degree. They were badasses I could never be. And then from there, kind of just kept going down that path for a while. No one really gave a crap. There was a whole lot of studies. Most of those guys worked for NASA. And then it gets to be the 90s. And we all know what happened in the 90s, the interwebs. And so you started to get these people who, hey, you know what, maybe web pages shouldn't be this giant, long thing full of nothing but text and, animated GIFs and whatnot. So people actually started to care about, flow of webs, and then you started getting people talking about, click-throughs and things that actually proved to be not quite so true. But, back then, now, it was usability, it was pretty much what you called those guys, but now it's kind of gotten to this whole new level, and this is a very recent thing in the last couple of years, where it's all about experience. It's been around for a little while, but honestly, the big kicker, really, that kind of made this kind of at the forefront is the iPhone. It kind of it didn't change anyone in the industry necessarily, it changed everyone around them to go, hey, these guys, we should actually pay them, this is a good thing to have. So a lot of companies actually don't have these departments, so you see why things work the way they do. So anyways, I'll just to boil these down, really, it's kind of just basically, figure out what people need, really make sure you understand those needs. Like, a lot of times you'll have, focus groups or, usability testing, things like that, and people will sit there and they'll say, they'll do sort of something you do in court that you're not allowed to do, where you say what someone else said. It's this very similar thing. You'll get someone in a usability study and they'll quickly start saying, well, I would do this, or the guy I work with would do this, and honestly, that's pretty much the stuff you filter out. You don't want to listen to that at all. You really want to watch what they do, not what they say. So if they say that something's easy to read, but then they can't ever hit the button, well, clearly it's not. And then a lot of times that's because, people don't want your feelings, they know you probably designed it, whatever the reason is, people will say one thing and do something completely different. One of the reasons why you always videotape it. Anyway, and so you try to understand what the user's doing, and then you prototype, validate, and just keep doing it over and over and over until you can't do it anymore. So what does it take to be a usability person? It's a little bit of armchair psychology, and by that I mean there's a little bit of sociology involved. Some of the people, not me, but some of the people in the degree actually in the field actually have psychology degrees, or at least minored in them. And really, honestly, it's about understanding people. And then there's also, the artist, which is usually where I come in. I'm a little more of the art side of it. But basically, it's understanding, how people interpret things. And part of that is, understanding the elements of design, how does contrast draw you to this and line to this and that kind of thing. But it's also understanding things like, color theory and stuff like that. And then the biggest part of it really is just kind of being a mad scientist inventor, where you just kind of sit there and say, you know what else would be cool? And you just sit in a room with a bunch of people who are just as, kind of bipolar and crazy as you, and you just do this. And you walk out of there and you go home and your spouse thinks you're totally nuts and a total nerd, and that's fine. And, this actually seemed less ironic before I chose this outfit today. Honestly, I put this in there and I'm like, that guy's a douchebag. And then I get up here and I'm like, and I'm wearing that outfit. All right, see you fine. So, didn't have time to change it, but there you go. Anyway, this guy is not someone you'd normally see in usability. He looks like a prick. Anyway, so getting back to form. Reasons to bank on form. These are nice little pretty slides, but okay, so this is I kind of just put the most important one up front. You really can't divorce emotion from evaluation. When someone looks at something, they don't just look at what it is, they look at how it makes them feel. And there's actually I think it's the next slide, but I'll talk about this really cool book in a second that kind of gets a little bit into that, but I'll stop doing that on the mic. The interesting thing that I've got up here, so this is Bang & Olufsen. I don't know if everyone heard of Bang & Olufsen, but they make